Hello. We are going to talk about film genre today. A quick introduction. So, if you haven't already done so, please get out your notebook so we can jot down a few quick notes. I'm going to try to plow through the reading as quickly as possible. One, because my voice sounds awful and you don't want to listen to it. And two, you want to get to the movie. So, let's just quickly go through this. Film genre, it's a concept with which we're all familiar. If you remember those delightful days back in, way, way, way back in your childhood, where you actually went to a movie store and browsed the aisles, pre Netflix. The movie stores were organized by genre. You'd go to the family section, you'd go to the comedy section, you'd go to the horror section, and you still get that with streaming services today. But it's a way to classify films. So, all moviegoers are familiar with the idea of genre, even if they don't know the term. The word genre is originally French, and it simply means kind or type. I would write that down. It's related to another word, genus, which is used in the biological sciences to classify groups of plants and animals. So, genre, genus might be a good idea to write those down. It'll help you remember what that definition is. When we speak of film genres, we're indicating certain types of movies: the science fiction film, the action picture, the comedy, the romance, the musical, the western, which is what we're going to focus on. These are some genres of fictional storytelling cinema. Scientists can usually place plants or animals within a single genus with confidence, but film genres lack that sort of scientific precision. Instead, genres are convenient terms that develop informally. Filmmakers, industry decision makers, critics, and viewers all contribute to the formation of a shared sense that certain films seem to resemble one another in significant ways. Genres also change over time as filmmakers invent new twists on old formulas. Thus, defining the precise boundaries between genres can be tricky. So, in addition to writing down the definition of genre, I would also write down that genres change over time. If you were to look at a horror film in the 1940s, you would get movies like The Birds. But if you were to look at horror films today, they are much more gory, much more dramatic, a lot more jump scares. All right, so now we're going to look at how can you actually define a genre. So, what we're going to do is start right here. Most scholars now agree that no genre can be defined in a single hard and fast way. Some genres stand out by their subjects or themes. A gangster film centers on large scale urban crime. A science fiction film features technology beyond the reach of contemporary science. A western is usually about life on some frontier, not necessarily the American West, as North to Alaska and Drums Along the Mohawk suggest. So, we're going to create a list here of what sort of things can define a genre, and the first two are subject or theme. Subject and theme. So, obviously, a romance film features the theme love conquers all. Yet, subject matter or theme is not so central to defining other genres. Musicals are recognizable chiefly by their manner of presentation, singing, dancing, or both. So, the third one, so we've got subjects, themes. The third one is manner of presentation. They all are musicals because they all have singing, dancing, or both, but they don't necessarily share the same subjects or themes. So, that would be the third defining feature of a genre. The detective film is partly defined by the plot pattern of an investigation that solves a mystery, and some genres are defined by the distinctive emotional effect they aim for: amusement in comedies, tension in suspense films. So, number four will be plot pattern, and number five is the distinctive emotional effect. Now, I'm going to save you some time and not go through this whole thing completely, but basically, what the text goes on to say is that there are many, many films that straddle multiple genres. They seem like they're a romance film, but they're also a mystery film, and they're also, a thriller. And that's what makes genre such an interesting thing, is that different people can watch different films and classify them different ways. All right, now we're going to transition to the Western. And if you haven't seen a Western, I would definitely take good notes on this, because this is the central focus of our unit. Because the Western, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, is kind of a dying genre in American cinema. It used to be kind of the cornerstone of American cinema. So let's quickly talk about it. I'm going to jump right here. The central theme. So, Westerns, quite early, the central theme of the genre became, write this down, the conflict between civilized order and the lawless frontier. And usually in a Western, you get civilized order is the town and lawless frontier, so the cowboys, and the lawless frontier is Native Americans, oftentimes played pretty offensively. Or sometimes you get, greedy cattle barons and things like that. From the east and the city come the settlers who want to raise families, the school teachers who aim to spread learning, and the bankers and government officials. In the vast natural spaces, by contrast, thrive those outside civilization, not only the American Indians, but also outlaws, trappers and traders, and greedy cattle barons. Now, what's interesting about this civilized order and lawless frontier is that that theme shows up in so many films, whether or not they look like a Western. So, if you're going to pick a film like one of my favorites, Sister Act 2, you've got these unruly students who don't want to learn and these teachers who are trying to keep order and keep the peace. You've got Civilized Order's Lawless Frontier. Doesn't look like a Western, but it shares that theme. If you were to look at movies like Alien or any sort of extraterrestrial films where you've got man who is supposed to represent civilized order and these unknown beings, that would be the lawless frontier. Iconography is another term I want you to write down. Iconography reinforces this basic duality. The covered wagon and the railroad are set against the horse and the canoe. The schoolhouse and church contrast with a lonely campfire in the hills. As in most genres, costume is iconographically significant too. The settlers' starched dresses and Sunday suits stand out against Indians' tribal garb and cowboys' jeans and Stetsons. So basically, iconography, if you know the word iconic, iconography means objects, situations, costumes, settings that are iconic of that genre. So when you think westerns, you think swinging saloon doors. You think showdown at high noon. You think cowboys, fiddling their fingers on their pistols on their hip. You think the tumbleweed. All of those different things. That is iconography. All right, now we're going to talk about the typical hero, kind of the stock character of a Western. Interestingly, the typical Western hero stands between the two thematic poles, at home in the wilderness, but naturally inclined toward justice and kindness. The cowboy is often poised between savagery and civilization. So basically, we've got the good bad guy, the Lone Ranger, the person who is pulled between both sides, tries to keep the peace, but in the end, really shows no loyalty to anyone except for himself. That's why I kind of think Princess Mononoke is an interesting film because Prince Ashitaka, he's pulled between both sides. He's pulled between San and Lady Eboshi, the people of Irontown. He tries to keep the peace, and in the end, he is the Lone Ranger. And I think that's all we're going to cover as far as the Western genre. A few more quick things I'm going to plow through, and then we'll be done. Okay, so we've talked about these. We talked about iconography. Okay, cinematic style is another thing I want you to write down. How is that genre shot? So generally with a Western, as you can see on the screen, you get these like high angle shots of this long empty stretch. A lot of times you get close-up shots of them squinting their eyes or spitting, or close-up of the spurs, close-up of them with their hands on their pistols. So oftentimes genres are shot in a similar way. Very last thing, the stages of genre, there's 4 of them. So make sure you write down all 4 of these. I mentioned earlier that genres change over time and they kind of go through this pattern. The first stage of genre is primitive. This is when the genre is first being introduced, themes are being developed, iconography is being created. It's the early stage of that particular film. So if you've seen Scarface, not the new one, the old one that's from like 1920, black and white film, that was an early gangster film. It established everything about gangster films that you see even today. So those are kind of like the OG films, primitive genre. Then when a genre's been around for a while, it moves into the classical phase. That's when it is most popular, it's most obvious, and you can look at that and say, ah, yeah, that's a classic Western, or oh, that's a classic horror film. Now, when the genre's been around for a while and people start to get sick of it or they want something new, we move into the revisionist stage. And you might see similar iconography, but it might not be exactly the same. So, for example, in a Western, you usually see cowboys wear cowboy hats, but if someone wanted to do a revisionist take on a Western, maybe they'd be wearing fedoras or top hats. So it's kind of a nod to it, but it's not as blatant. Um, it kind of questions the original value of the genre, and you really have to look for the ties. It doesn't really look like that particular genre. It doesn't look like a gangster film, or it doesn't look like a Western film, or it doesn't look like a sci-fi film, but it really is. And then the last stage, when it's been around for a long, long, long time, people are so sick of it, they want to make fun of it, it moves into parodic stage. That's where you mock the genre. You still might have the theme, you still might have the same stock characters, you might have that iconography, but have it be really highlighted. So maybe they're wearing cowboy hats, but it's like an oversized Arby's size cowboy hat. And it's just meant to be silly. So if you've seen the scary movie movies, those are definitely a parodic take on the horror genre. Okay, so the stages of genre are really, really important because this is actually what you're going to be doing when you watch Kung Fu Hustle. In your notebook on a new sheet of paper, this is something you're going to turn in. I want you to create 3 columns that represent the 4 stages. Primitive and classical are so close together that I lumped them there. So the first stage is basically classical. What looks like a classic Western? We're going to focus specifically on Western. Revisionist. Where do we see things that are kind of linked to a Western, but they're not as obvious? You have to look for them. And where do we see the Western genre being made fun of? So your job as you watch Kung Fu Hustle is to write those in. So, for example, in the very first scene, you're going to see a showdown. You're going to see people board up the doors. You're going to see this long, empty stretch. You're going to see cowboy hats, cowboy boots. That would all be classical. Revisionist. Okay. You might, well, one, the fact that it's set in China is revisionist. It's not set in the American West, so that's a little bit different. And they also kind of mix in this gangster vibe, so it doesn't feel as much like a Western. They've got kung fu, and it's not as much, the pistols. So that would be revisionist. And then parodic is if you've got like a damsel in distress character and she's ridiculous, or the comedic violence that I hinted at before. That would be parodic. So today, start watching Kung Fu Hustle, enjoy it, try to fill out at least a little bit in each of the 3 columns, and we will pick up where you left off on Monday.